The grandfather clock in the drawing-room of Thornfield Manor struck 13 times at the stroke of midnight, and with that impossible chime, our weekend of pleasant country hospitality transformed into something far more sinister than any of us could have imagined. I am, as readers of these chronicles will know, Captain Arthur Hastings, and I confess that even now, months after the events I'm about to relate, the memory of that 13th stroke still sends an involuntary shiver down my spine. It was not merely the mechanical impossibility of the sound that disturbed us all, though that was unsettling enough, but rather the profound sense that we had just witnessed the announcement of something terrible yet to come. My friend Hercule Poirot, seated in his characteristic pose of alert observation near the fireplace, had tilted his head at the first chime with the precise attention of a conductor listening to his orchestra. By the 12th stroke, his green eyes had narrowed with that particular intensity I'd learned to recognize as the first stirring of his famous little gray cells. When the 13th chime rang out, clear and unmistakable in the sudden silence of the elegant drawing-room, Poirot's mustache twitched in a manner that suggested he found the impossibility not alarming, but rather interesting. The gathering of suspects. A house full of secrets. We had arrived at Thornfield Manor that crisp November afternoon as guests of Lady Margaret Ashworth, a woman whose reputation for hosting the most intellectually stimulating house parties in the county was matched only by her talent for assembling guests who harbored the most fascinating secrets. Lady Ashworth, a striking woman of 55 with silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and eyes that missed nothing, had extended her invitation to Poirot with the sort of calculated charm that suggested she had motives beyond mere social pleasantry. "My dear Monsieur Poirot," she had said upon our arrival, "I do hope you won't find our little gathering too terribly dull. We are such ordinary people here in the countryside." The smile that accompanied this statement was anything but ordinary, containing as it did layers of meaning that even I could detect. The other guests had been introduced with Lady Ashworth's characteristic flair for dramatic presentation. Dr. Julian Thorne, a distinguished physician in his early 60s, possessed the sort of bedside manner that inspired confidence in his patients and unease in everyone else. His pale, intelligent eyes seemed to catalogue every word and gesture for future reference, and I noticed that his hands, despite their obvious skill, bore a slight tremor that he attempted to conceal. Miss Evelyn Hartwell, Lady Ashworth's niece and heir, was a young woman of perhaps 28, whose beauty was of the cool, classical variety that photographs well but reveals little of the person beneath. She had recently returned from an extended stay in Paris, ostensibly to study art, though whispered conversations suggested her departure had been prompted by a scandal involving a married man and a considerable sum of money. Colonel James Weatherby, retired from service in India, brought with him the ramrod posture and clipped speech patterns of a career military man. Yet beneath his bluff exterior, I detected a nervousness that seemed at odds with his martial bearing. His frequent glances toward the windows and his habit of positioning himself with his back to the wall suggested a man who had learned to expect danger from unexpected quarters. The final member of our party was Mr. Simon Blackwood, Lady Ashworth's business manager and, according to local gossip, something more than a mere employee. A man of 40 with prematurely grey hair and the sort of understated elegance that speaks of good breeding and careful economy, Blackwood possessed the invaluable ability to remain nearly invisible while observing everything. Poirot's arrival and initial observations. Poirot had accepted Lady Ashworth's invitation, not, as she supposed, because of her social prominence, but because of a single intriguing detail mentioned in her letter. The grandfather clock in her drawing-room had begun keeping impossible time. "A clock that lies, Hastings," he had mused during our journey, "is like a witness who cannot be trusted. One must ask not only why it lies, but who benefits from the deception." The clock itself was indeed a magnificent piece, a towering mahogany case housing a mechanism that had, according to Lady Ashworth, kept perfect time for over 2 centuries. Crafted by the renowned clockmaker Thomas Mudge in 1785, it had been a wedding gift to the first Lady Ashworth and had become something of a family treasure. The brass pendulum swung with metronomic precision, and the elaborate dial, decorated with phases of the moon and zodiacal signs, had always been a source of pride for the family. Yet for the past month, Lady Ashworth explained as we examined the timepiece before dinner, it has begun to misbehave. Not in its timekeeping, you understand. It remains as accurate as ever. But occasionally, at moments of particular significance, it strikes 13 times instead of 12, always at midnight and always when something important is about to happen. Poirot had examined the mechanism with the thoroughness of a master craftsman, his small hands moving delicately over the brass works. "The mechanism, it is perfect," he pronounced finally. "There is no fault in the construction, no wear in the parts. If this clock strikes 13, it is not because it cannot help itself. It is because someone wishes it to do so." The mysterious atmosphere builds. Dinner that evening had been a masterpiece of culinary art and social tension. The conversation flowed with the polished ease of people accustomed to saying much while revealing little. Yet beneath the surface, courtesy, currents of anxiety and suspicion ran deep. Dr. Thorne spoke eloquently of his recent research into nervous disorders, his clinical descriptions carrying an undertone that suggested personal as well as professional interest. Miss Hartwell deflected questions about her time in Paris with practiced skill, while Colonel Weatherby's war stories grew increasingly elaborate as the evening progressed. It was Mr. Blackwood who first mentioned the peculiar incidents that had begun occurring around the time of the clock's strange behavior. "Small things," he said with careful understatement, "but disturbing nonetheless. Papers misplaced in Lady Ashworth's study, servants reporting strange sounds in the night, and twice now, visitors arriving at the manor claiming to have appointments that were never made." Lady Ashworth had laughed off these concerns with the sort of brittle gaiety that fooled no one. "Really, Simon, you make us sound like a house from a Gothic novel. Next, you'll be telling our guests that we have mysterious lights in the tower and chains rattling in the cellars." "Do you?" Poirot had inquired with genuine interest. The silence that followed this question was broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock, its sound suddenly seeming less comforting than ominous. The 13th strike and its aftermath. As midnight approached, we had gathered in the drawing room for coffee and brandy, the conversation having turned to lighter topics in an apparent attempt to dispel the evening's growing tension. It was then that the impossible occurred, the clock's measured chimes counting out the hour until that final, inexplicable 13th stroke rang through the room like a death knell. In the stunned silence that followed, I became aware of several things simultaneously. The way Dr. Thorne's brandy glass trembled in his hand, Miss Hartwell's sharp intake of breath, and Colonel Weatherby's instinctive movement toward what I realized was a concealed weapon. But it was Mr. Blackwood's reaction that proved most telling. He had gone completely pale and was staring at Lady Ashworth with an expression of unmistakable fear. "Well," said Lady Ashworth with forced lightness, "there you have it, Monsieur Poirot. Our impossible clock has performed for you exactly as promised. Now perhaps you can explain how a mechanism that has kept perfect time for over 2 centuries has suddenly developed such theatrical tendencies." Poirot rose from his chair with the deliberate precision that characterized all his movements. "Madame," he said quietly, "I fear that your clock has not developed theatrical tendencies. Rather, I suspect that someone in this house has developed murderous ones, and your clock has been chosen to announce their intentions." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and in that moment I realized that our pleasant weekend in the country had become something far more dangerous. Somewhere in Thornfield Manor, a killer was preparing to strike, and the grandfather clock that had just defied the laws of time itself would somehow play a crucial role in the deadly drama about to unfold. As if summoned by Poirot's ominous pronouncement, a scream suddenly pierced the night air, a woman's voice, filled with terror and disbelief. The sound came from the direction of Lady Ashworth's private study, and as we rushed toward it, I could not help but notice that the grandfather clock had begun to chime again, though my watch showed it was barely 5 minutes past midnight. This time, however, it struck only once, a single, solemn note that seemed to toll not for the hour, but for the dead. The scream that pierced the night air came from the direction of Lady Ashworth's study, and as we rushed through the darkened corridors of Thornfield Manor, I could not shake the feeling that the grandfather clock's impossible 13th chime had been a harbinger of the tragedy we were about to discover. We found the study door standing slightly ajar, a thin line of lamplight cutting through the shadows. Rose Chandler, Lady Ashworth's personal maid, stood trembling in the corridor, her face white with shock and her hands pressed against her mouth as if to prevent another scream from escaping. "In there, sir," she gasped when she saw Poirot approaching. "Her ladyship—" "Oh, dear God, what's happened to her?" Poirot placed a gentle but firm hand on the maid's shoulder. "Courage, mademoiselle. You will please to step aside and tell us exactly what you observed." Colonel Weatherby, displaying the decisive action that had no doubt served him well in military campaigns, pushed the door fully open. The sight that greeted us was one that will remain etched in my memory forever. Lady Margaret Ashworth lay motionless on the Persian carpet before her mahogany writing desk, her silver hair loosened from its elegant arrangement, her evening gown darkened by a spreading stain across the bodice. Her eyes stared sightlessly at the ornate ceiling, and her right arm was flung out at an unnatural angle, as if she had tried to reach for something in her final moments. Dr. Thorne immediately dropped to his knees beside the body, his professional instincts overriding the shock that was evident on his pale features. He placed 2 fingers against Lady Ashworth's throat, then carefully examined the wound, his movements precise despite the slight tremor I had noticed in his hands earlier. "Shot through the heart," he pronounced after a moment, his voice steady but grim. "Small caliber, fired at close range. Death would have been almost instantaneous." He glanced at his pocket watch. "Given the temperature of the body and the state of the blood, I would estimate she died no more than 10 minutes ago." Miss Evelyn Hartwell had followed us into the room, but upon seeing her aunt's body, she swayed dangerously and grasped the door frame for support. Her face had gone ashen, and I noticed that her hands were trembling violently. Mr. Blackwood moved to steady her, but what struck me most forcefully was his own reaction, or rather, his curious lack of one. While the rest of us displayed varying degrees of shock and horror, Blackwood's expression was one of grim resignation, as if the terrible scene before us was somehow expected rather than surprising. Poirot had not approached the body immediately. Instead, he stood just inside the doorway, his green eyes moving methodically around the room, cataloguing every detail with the precision of a master craftsman examining a complex mechanism. His gaze lingered on the desk lamp, which still burned brightly, casting a warm pool of light over what appeared to be an unfinished letter. The fountain pen lay uncapped beside the paper, and I could see that the ink was still wet. "No one is to touch anything," Poirot announced quietly but firmly. "Colonel Weatherby, if you would be so good as to ensure that no one enters or leaves this room until the authorities arrive." The colonel nodded and positioned himself by the door, his military bearing reasserting itself in the face of crisis. "Rose," Poirot continued, addressing the maid with gentle authority, "you will tell us precisely what you observed. Take your time and omit no detail, however small it may seem." The young woman drew a shuddering breath. "I was bringing up the late tea service to the blue sitting room, sir. Her ladyship sometimes took tea after midnight when she was working late. I had just reached the top of the servants' stairs when I heard that dreadful clock striking all those impossible chimes. Then, just as it finished, there was a sound, not quite a shot, more like something heavy falling. I came down the corridor, and the study door was standing open just as you see it now. When I looked inside and saw her ladyship..." She pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. "You heard no gunshot?" Poirot inquired. "No, sir. Only that thudding sound, as if someone had dropped a heavy book." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And in the moments before you discovered the body, did you see anyone in the corridors? Anyone leaving this area of the house?" Rose shook her head emphatically. "No one, sir. The corridor was empty." I examined the room more carefully, noting the 2 tall windows that looked out over the front lawn. Both were closed and latched from the inside, their heavy curtains drawn against the night. There was no other entrance to the study save the door through which we had entered. "A locked room mystery," I murmured to Poirot. "Not precisely, mon ami," he replied, his eyes fixed on something near the desk. "But certainly a mystery of timing and opportunity." Dr. Thorne rose from beside the body, wiping his hands with his handkerchief. "The wound is clean and precise," he reported. "Whoever did this knew exactly where to aim for maximum effect. There are no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. I would say Lady Ashworth was taken completely by surprise." It was then that I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the small table beside Lady Ashworth's chair sat a brandy snifter, still half full, with a faint impression of lipstick on its rim. But beside it was a second glass, completely empty, as if someone had been sharing a late-night drink with the victim just before her death. Poirot had noticed it too, and his mustache twitched in that characteristic way that indicated his little grey cells were beginning their intricate work. "Interesting," he murmured. It would appear that Lady Ashworth was not alone in her final hour. Colonel Weatherby had dispatched one of the footmen to telephone the local constabulary, and within 20 minutes Inspector Graves arrived from the market town, accompanied by a sergeant and a constable. Graves was a competent man, methodical in his approach, though lacking the imaginative spark that Poirot brought to such matters. As the inspector began his preliminary examination of the scene, I watched the reactions of our fellow house guests with growing unease. Miss Hartwell had regained some of her composure, but her eyes kept darting toward the desk where her aunt had been writing. Mr. Blackwood stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of professional concern, yet I detected something else beneath the surface. Was it relief? Colonel Weatherby maintained his military bearing, but I noticed that he had positioned himself where he could observe all the exits, as if expecting danger from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Thorne, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to assist Inspector Graves with the medical aspects of the examination, his professional expertise proving invaluable. Yet even as he worked, I caught him glancing repeatedly at his pocket watch, as if the passage of time held some particular significance for him. "The timing is most curious," Poirot observed quietly to me as we watched the proceedings. Lady Ashworth dies at the precise moment when her impossible clock strikes 13. One might almost think the murderer wished to announce his crime to the entire household. "But why?" I asked. "Surely a killer would want to avoid drawing attention to the moment of the crime." Poirot's eyes gleamed with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. But that assumes our murderer fears discovery, mon ami. What if, instead, he wishes to ensure that his crime is discovered at precisely the right moment, by precisely the right people? The implications of his words sent a chill down my spine. As Inspector Graves continued his methodical examination of the crime scene, I realized that we were dealing with something far more complex than a simple murder. Someone in Thornfield Manor had orchestrated not just Lady Ashworth's death, but the very manner of its discovery, using the mysterious grandfather clock as both timepiece and accomplice in their deadly design. The game, as Poirot would say, was afoot, and the 13th hour had only just begun to reveal its secrets. Inspector Graves proved to be a methodical man, possessed of the sort of steady competence that served rural constabularies well, though perhaps lacking the imaginative spark that more complex crimes demanded. Within the hour, he had established a systematic approach to the investigation, sealing Lady Ashworth's study and arranging for the body to be removed to a secure location pending the coroner's examination. "We'll proceed with formal interviews," he announced to the assembled company in the drawing room, where the grandfather clock continued its measured ticking as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Each of you will provide a detailed account of your movements from the time Lady Ashworth retired to her study until the discovery of the body." Poirot had positioned himself in his characteristic pose of alert observation, his green eyes moving constantly between the suspects and the imposing timepiece that had announced the crime with such theatrical precision. I noticed that his attention kept returning to certain details we'd observed in the study, particularly the 2 brandy glasses and the unfinished letter with its still wet ink. The interviews began with Miss Evelyn Hartwell, who maintained her composure with visible effort. "I retired to my room shortly after 11, she stated, her voice carefully controlled. Aunt Margaret had mentioned her intention to work late in her study. I had developed a headache during dinner and took a sleeping powder, half a dose only. I was awakened by that dreadful 13th chime and moments later heard Rose scream." Inspector Graves made careful notes. "Can anyone verify your movements after leaving the drawing room?" "Mr. Blackwood saw me go upstairs," she replied, glancing briefly toward the business manager. "We exchanged a few words about some correspondence." Blackwood confirmed this with a nod, but I noticed something in his expression, a tension that suggested their conversation had involved more than routine estate matters. Dr. Thorne was questioned next, his professional demeanor intact despite the circumstances. "I remained in the drawing room with the other gentlemen until shortly before midnight," he reported. "When I retired to my room, I could hear Lady Ashworth moving about in her study. The walls in this old house carry sound quite clearly." "Did you hear anything unusual?" Graves inquired. The doctor hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Lady Ashworth had been consulting me recently about certain medical matters. Hypothetical questions, she claimed, regarding nervous disorders, anxiety symptoms, the effects of prolonged stress on the human constitution." This revelation caused a visible stir among the assembled company. Colonel Weatherby shifted uncomfortably, while Mr. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She was asking about someone specific," Poirot interjected quietly. "I suspected as much, though she insisted the questions were merely academic. She wanted to know if guilt or fear could manifest in physical symptoms, tremors, insomnia, erratic behavior." When Colonel Weatherby's turn came, his military bearing served him well, though I detected an underlying nervousness that his disciplined exterior could not entirely conceal. "I was in the library until the disturbance," he stated firmly, "reading military history and enjoying a final brandy. The clock's impossible chiming startled me, naturally, but I heard nothing else until the scream." "Colonel," Poirot observed gently, "you have been a frequent guest at Thornfield Manor." "Indeed. Lady Ashworth was most kind in her invitations. We shared memories of India, where I served with her late husband. And recently there have been no difficulties in your circumstances." The colonel's face flushed slightly. "My personal affairs are hardly relevant to this investigation." "Perhaps not," Poirot agreed mildly. "But Inspector Graves must consider all possibilities, n'est-ce pas?" Mr. Blackwood's interview proved most revealing. While maintaining his professional composure, he disclosed information that cast the evening's events in a more complex light. Lady Ashworth had discovered certain irregularities in the estate accounts, he admitted reluctantly. "Nothing definitive, but patterns that concerned her. She had asked me to conduct a thorough review." "What sort of irregularities?" Miss Hartwell demanded, clearly surprised by this revelation. "Discrepancies in household expenses, unexplained withdrawals from investment accounts. The amounts were not enormous individually, but the pattern suggested systematic misappropriation." "And when did these discoveries begin?" Inspector Graves asked. "Approximately 1 month ago. Curiously, it coincided with the clock's strange behavior." Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Most illuminating. And Lady Ashworth's reaction to these discoveries? She was deeply troubled. She spoke of feeling betrayed by someone she trusted, someone close to the family. She had been conducting her own investigation, keeping certain documents locked in her study safe. The implications of this revelation were not lost on anyone present. Each suspect now had to consider not only their alibi for the evening, but their potential exposure in Lady Ashworth's private investigation. As Inspector Graves concluded the formal interviews, Poirot approached the grandfather clock once more, studying its brass mechanism with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "A timepiece that announces crimes," he murmured to me, "suggests a criminal who wishes his work to be discovered at precisely the right moment, by precisely the right people." The drawing room fell silent except for the clock's steady rhythm, each tick seeming to count down toward revelations that none of the assembled company appeared eager to face. In the space of one impossible hour, Thornfield Manor had transformed from a haven of country hospitality into a web of suspicion, where every guest harbored secrets, and every secret might prove to be a motive for murder. The 13th hour had struck, and with it, the beginning of a deadly game where time itself had become both witness and accomplice to the truth that lay hidden in the shadows of respectability. The morning brought Inspector Graves back to Thornfield Manor with the satisfied air of a man who believed he had solved his case. He assembled the household in the drawing room, where the grandfather clock continued its measured ticking, seemingly oblivious to the drama it had helped orchestrate the night before. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graves announced, placing a leather portfolio on the mahogany table with ceremonial precision, "we have made a significant discovery. Lady Ashworth's study contained a concealed wall safe hidden behind the portrait of her late husband. Inside, we found documents that shed considerable light on both motive and perpetrator." He opened the portfolio with deliberate care, revealing a collection of papers covered in Lady Ashworth's distinctive handwriting. These are Lady Ashworth's private financial records, documenting systematic embezzlement from the estate accounts over the past 6 months. The evidence is comprehensive and damning. Falsified invoices, payments to non-existent suppliers, and unauthorized transfers to offshore accounts. Miss Evelyn Hartwell gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. Colonel Weatherby's military bearing stiffened while Dr. Thorne leaned forward with clinical interest. Mr. Blackwood, who had been standing near the window, turned slowly, his face draining of color. "The final entry," Graves continued, "dated yesterday afternoon, records Lady Ashworth's decision to confront the perpetrator last evening after the other guests had retired. According to her notes, she had arranged a private meeting in her study to present this evidence and demand restitution." His gaze fixed on Blackwood with prosecutorial certainty. "The evidence points unequivocally to Mr. Simon Blackwood as both embezzler and murderer." The silence that followed was broken only by the clock's relentless ticking. Blackwood straightened his shoulders with visible effort. "Inspector, these allegations are preposterous. I have managed Lady Ashworth's affairs with complete integrity for 8 years. If such documents exist, they must be forgeries or the result of some terrible misunderstanding." "Forgeries?" Graves scoffed. "Written in Lady Ashworth's own hand, with her distinctive ink and paper?" "I think not, Mr. Blackwood. The motive is clear. You killed Lady Ashworth to prevent her from exposing your theft and sending you to prison." Colonel Weatherby found his voice. "Good God, Blackwood, is this true? Have you been stealing from Margaret all this time?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Graves replied before Blackwood could respond. "We have motive, opportunity, and the victim's own testimony from beyond the grave, as it were." It was then that Poirot, who had been listening with his characteristic pose of alert observation, cleared his throat softly. "Inspector," he said, his voice carrying a note of gentle inquiry, "you find this evidence entirely convincing?" "Absolutely, Monsieur Poirot. It's as clear-cut a case as I've seen in 20 years of police work." Poirot's mustache twitched almost imperceptibly. Indeed. And yet, one might ask oneself, is it not perhaps too clear-cut? Consider, if you please, the nature of this discovery. A hidden safe, yes, but one that yields its secrets readily to investigation. Documents that lay out the crime in meticulous detail, preserved as if for the convenience of the authorities. He rose from his chair and began to pace slowly before the fireplace. Tell me, Inspector, if you had been embezzling funds for months and planned to murder your employer to conceal your crime, would you leave such a comprehensive record of your misdeeds locked in her private safe? Would you not rather destroy such evidence, or at minimum, retrieve it after the murder? Graves frowned. Perhaps he didn't have time or didn't know about the safe. But Monsieur Blackwood has managed Lady Ashworth's affairs for 8 years. Surely he would know of any safe in her study. And if he killed her to prevent exposure, why leave the very evidence that would expose him so conveniently arranged for discovery? Dr. Thorne leaned forward with interest. What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot? I'm suggesting, mon ami, that we are witnessing a performance, a carefully orchestrated drama designed to focus our attention on one suspect while the true culprit remains hidden in the shadows. Poirot's eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. Someone has taken great care to present us with a solution that appears unassailable, yet crumbles under logical examination. Miss Hartwell's voice was barely a whisper. You mean someone else killed Aunt Margaret and is trying to frame Mr. Blackwood? Précisément, mademoiselle. Someone who understood not only how to commit murder, but how to direct the subsequent investigation toward a predetermined conclusion. Poirot's gaze swept across the assembled company. Someone who had access to Lady Ashworth's writing materials, her private papers, and, most importantly, her complete trust. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a countdown to revelations that would shatter the careful facade of respectability that masked a killer's true identity. The game, Poirot murmured, grows more interesting by the hour. Inspector Graves bristled visibly at Poirot's gentle but persistent questioning of his conclusions. Monsieur Poirot, with all due respect to your considerable reputation, the evidence against Mr. Blackwood is overwhelming. We have clear motive, established opportunity, and the victim's own documentation of his crimes. He gestured toward his leather portfolio with the satisfaction of a man who believed justice was both swift and certain. Mr. Blackwood will be taken into custody immediately. Blackwood, who had maintained his composure throughout the interrogation, finally spoke with quiet resignation. Inspector, I will not resist arrest, but I must tell you the complete truth about last evening. Lady Ashworth did indeed ask me to meet her in her study at 11:30. She said there were important estate matters requiring immediate discussion. Aha! Graves exclaimed triumphantly. You admit you were alone with the victim shortly before her death. I left her alive and well, Blackwood replied steadily. We spoke for perhaps 15 minutes about certain financial transactions she had questioned. She seemed troubled, yes, but not hostile. When she dismissed me shortly before midnight, I went directly to my room and spent the next hour writing correspondence. The night porter can verify that I rang for additional writing paper at 12:15. Poirot's mustache twitched with interest. Most illuminating, Monsieur Blackwood. A man who has just committed murder rarely spends the subsequent hour attending to his correspondence. It is not, how do you say, psychologically harmonious with the crime of passion or desperation. Psychology be damned, Graves retorted impatiently. The night porter is a servant of this house, hardly an impartial witness. Letters can be written at any time to establish a false alibi. But Poirot was studying Blackwood with that peculiar intensity I had learned to recognize. Tell me, monsieur, your reaction to these accusations. It strikes me as curiously accepting. A man unjustly accused, particularly one with your business acumen, would surely mount a more vigorous defense. Blackwood's shoulders sagged slightly. What defense can I offer against Lady Ashworth's own handwriting? If she documented my supposed crimes so meticulously, who would believe my protestations of innocence? Precisely the reaction our true murderer hoped to achieve, Poirot murmured, his green eyes gleaming. Inspector, consider, if you will, a most intriguing possibility. What if the situation were entirely reversed? What if murder was the motive for creating evidence of embezzlement, rather than embezzlement being the motive for murder? The silence that followed was profound. Even Graves paused in his note-taking, his pen suspended over the paper as he grappled with this unexpected perspective. Dr. Thorne leaned forward with clinical interest. You're suggesting someone killed Lady Ashworth for entirely different reasons, then fabricated evidence to implicate Blackwood? I'm suggesting more than that, mon ami. I'm suggesting that our true murderer understood the psychology of investigation, that authorities would naturally focus on the most obvious motive and the most obvious suspect, particularly when presented with such compelling documentary evidence. Miss Evelyn Hartwell, who had been growing increasingly pale during this exchange, gripped the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. But who would have such intimate knowledge of Aunt Margaret's affairs, her handwriting, her private papers? Indeed, mademoiselle, who would have regular access to her study, her correspondence, her financial records? Someone she trusted implicitly, who could arrange a private meeting without arousing the slightest suspicion. Colonel Weatherby's military instincts were clearly awakening. By Jove, Poirot, you're absolutely right. Margaret was no fool. If she truly believed Blackwood was stealing from her, she would have taken precautions, copied the documents, contacted her solicitor, arranged for her safety. Unless, Poirot continued quietly, she had no reason to fear the person she was meeting. Unless she trusted them completely and believed the encounter would be merely a family discussion of delicate matters. The implications hung in the air like an accusation. I noticed that Miss Hartwell's hands had begun to tremble again, while Dr. Thorne adjusted his spectacles with nervous precision. Poirot returned his attention to the grandfather clock, his small hands tracing its brass mechanism with delicate care. This timepiece tells us more than its impossible chime, mes amis. It tells us that our murderer understood the household routine perfectly, knew exactly when each person would be in their rooms, when the servants would be occupied, when Lady Ashworth would be alone and vulnerable. He paused, his expression growing more intense. Most importantly, it tells us that our killer had both the knowledge and the opportunity to manipulate this mechanism, to ensure it would announce the crime at precisely the right moment, creating the perfect distraction for a gunshot that no one would recognize as such. Inspector Graves, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, made one final attempt to reassert his authority. These theories are fascinating, Monsieur Poirot, but I deal in concrete evidence, not speculation. Ah, but Inspector, Poirot replied with an enigmatic smile, sometimes the most concrete evidence is the most carefully constructed illusion. Our murderer is indeed clever, but not infallible. There is always the tiny flaw, the one imperfection that betrays even the most elaborate deception. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a countdown to justice. As Graves reluctantly postponed Blackwood's arrest pending further investigation, I realized that Poirot had successfully dismantled what appeared to be an airtight case, revealing instead the carefully constructed facade that concealed a far more sinister truth. The real game, as my friend would say, was only just beginning. The atmosphere at Thornfield Manor had shifted perceptibly since Poirot's intervention, like the moment when storm clouds gather but have not yet released their burden. Inspector Graves, though clearly discomfited by having his neat solution so methodically dismantled, proved sensible enough to recognize the validity of Poirot's reasoning. "Very well, Monsieur Poirot," Graves conceded with visible reluctance. "Mr. Blackwood will remain under house supervision rather than formal arrest. However, no one is to leave the estate, and I'll have constables posted at the gates. This investigation will proceed with proper thoroughness, regardless of how inconvenient that may prove." Poirot inclined his head graciously. "Merci, Inspector. You will find that thoroughness and truth are intimate companions in matters such as these. The evidence speaks." With Graves' grudging permission, we returned to Lady Ashworth's study for a more detailed examination. The morning light streaming through the tall windows revealed details that had been obscured by lamplight and the shock of discovery the previous evening. Poirot approached the writing desk with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "Observe, Hastings, this unfinished letter. It tells us much more than its incomplete state might suggest." He bent over the paper, his green eyes moving with scientific precision across Lady Ashworth's distinctive handwriting. "The letter is addressed to her solicitor," he murmured, "and begins with her intention to alter her will. She writes, 'Recent discoveries regarding the conduct and character of those close to me oblige me to make substantial—'" And then you see the sentence ends. Inspector Graves consulted his notebook, clearly interrupted by the murderer's arrival. "Ah, but notice, mon ami, how the sentence ends. There is no blot of ink, no wild stroke suggesting sudden alarm or interruption. The line terminates cleanly, as though she simply chose to stop writing." Poirot's mustache twitched with interest. "Furthermore, Dr. Thorne observed last evening that the ink was still damp when we discovered the body. The spread pattern of this final stroke, the curve of the S in substantial, was written with complete composure, not with a trembling hand under threat." The implications were unsettling. If Lady Ashworth had not been writing when attacked, what had she been doing in those final moments? Poirot's attention turned to the 2 brandy glasses that had been carefully preserved as evidence. One bears the clear impression of Lady Ashworth's lipstick, half consumed. The other is entirely empty, yet bears the residual aroma of fine cognac. This confirms Monsieur Blackwood's account of their meeting, but raises the question, who shared the second drink with her after his departure? He moved to examine the concealed safe behind Lord Ashworth's portrait, where the damning financial documents had been discovered. "Inspector, these records of supposed embezzlement, they are indeed comprehensive and damning, perhaps too comprehensive." He held up one particular ledger page. "Here, observe this calculation. £37, 4 shillings, recorded as £37 too. A minor error, one might say." "People make arithmetic mistakes," Graves observed. "Certainement. But Lady Ashworth, by all accounts, was meticulous with figures. She managed her own household accounts for decades without error. Yet if one were constructing false evidence, one might deliberately insert such a minor mistake to create the appearance of authentic human fallibility." Poirot's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "However, to place this single error in the one entry that most heavily implicates Monsieur Blackwood, that suggests not accident, but careful design. The mechanism of deception." Our examination was interrupted by the appearance of Miss Evelyn Hartwell in the corridor, carrying a small stack of correspondence and looking considerably more composed than she had the previous evening. "Miss Hartwell," Poirot inquired gently, "you're attending to estate business this morning." "Someone must," she replied, though I detected a slight tremor in her voice. "Aunt Margaret's affairs cannot simply cease because of this tragedy. Simon and I have always assisted with the administrative duties." "Most commendable. Tell me, your aunt's handwriting. You were familiar with it naturally." "Of course. I've seen it all my life." "And could you yourself reproduce it if circumstances required?" She looked startled. "Why should I wish to do such a thing?" "Merely curiosity, mademoiselle. Many people unconsciously absorb the writing characteristics of those with whom they frequently correspond. I suppose with sufficient practice, one might manage a reasonable approximation," she admitted reluctantly. As she continued down the corridor, Poirot watched her departure with that particular intensity I had learned to recognize. "She carries herself well," he murmured, "but the strain shows in small ways. the slight rigidity of her posture, the careful control of her voice. She's a woman walking on the edge of a precipice. The 13th hour's secret. We returned to the drawing room, where the grandfather clock continued its measured rhythm, seemingly innocent of the role it had played in the previous night's drama. Poirot stood before it, his small hands tracing the brass mechanism with delicate precision. This timepiece holds secrets, mes amis, not merely in its impossible chime, but in the very precision of that impossibility. He pointed to an almost imperceptible scratch near the Roman numeral 13. This mark, fresh, made by a tool designed to manipulate the striking mechanism. Someone with considerable mechanical knowledge modified this clock to strike 13 times at precisely midnight. But why? I asked, though I suspected the answer would prove as ingenious as it was disturbing. To create the perfect acoustic camouflage, mon ami. Rose heard a thud immediately after the 13th chime, the sound of Lady Ashworth's body falling, not the gunshot itself. The report of a small-caliber pistol, fired at the exact moment of that final, impossible chime, would be completely masked by the sound. Dr. Thorne leaned forward with professional interest. The timing would have to be absolutely precise. Précisément. Our killer is not merely someone who wished Lady Ashworth dead. They are an architect of deception, a master of timing who understood exactly how to manipulate both mechanism and human psychology to their advantage. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a countdown to revelations that would shatter the careful facade of respectability that concealed a killer's true identity. As the echoes faded, I realized that Poirot had begun his most dangerous game, the psychological chess match that would ultimately force the murderer to reveal themselves through their own actions and reactions. The real investigation, as my friend would say, was only just beginning. The afternoon brought with it the sort of oppressive atmosphere that precedes a thunderstorm, though the skies above Thornfield Manor remained deceptively clear. Poirot had requested the use of the small morning room for what he termed conversations of a more intimate nature. And Inspector Graves, though clearly uncomfortable with relinquishing control, had agreed to allow these private interviews. The human heart, Inspector, Poirot had explained with characteristic precision, is like a locked safe. Force will not open it, but the correct combination, applied with patience and understanding, will reveal all its secrets. The interviews begin. Miss Evelyn Hartwell was the first to join us in the morning room, where the soft afternoon light created an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility. She had changed from her morning dress into a simple grey ensemble, but I noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she arranged her skirts, and her eyes held a glassy quality that suggested she had been weeping. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, settling into his chair with that particular grace that somehow made even the most formal interrogation feel like a social call. "We find ourselves in circumstances most tragic, but perhaps you will help me to understand certain complexities that preceded your aunt's death." "I'm not sure what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," she replied, though her voice carried an undertone of wariness. "Your recent sojourn in Paris, for instance. I understand it was not entirely voluntary." The question struck home with visible force. Evelyn's composure, carefully maintained since the discovery of the body, began to crack like ice under sudden pressure. "You've been listening to gossip, I see." "Yes, Aunt Margaret sent me away. She discovered that I had become involved with someone she deemed unsuitable. A married gentleman, perhaps, among other complications." Her laugh was bitter. "She also discovered that I had borrowed rather heavily against my expected inheritance. Foolish investments, expensive tastes, and the sort of financial naivety that comes from never having to worry about money until suddenly you do." Poirot nodded with understanding rather than judgment. "And your aunt's reaction to these discoveries?" "She was furious, naturally. She spoke of betrayal, of trust squandered, of the family reputation. She took complete control of my remaining funds and made it clear that my future, my very survival, depended entirely upon her continued goodwill. Evelyn's voice grew quieter, more strained. She could be extraordinarily generous, but also utterly ruthless when she felt herself betrayed. And yet she brought you back to Thornfield, on her terms entirely. I was to be the dutiful niece, the grateful dependent, the heir who had learned her lesson. She looked directly at Poirot then, and I was struck by the complexity of emotions in her eyes. Grief, resentment, fear, and something that might have been relief. But I did love her, Monsieur Poirot. Despite everything, she was the only family I had. After Miss Hartwell departed, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, his fingertips pressed together in that familiar steeple. She tells us much, Hastings, but not everything. There is something she fears to reveal, not guilt, I think, but perhaps shame of a different sort. Dr. Thorne's revelations. Our next visitor was Dr. Thorne, who entered with his characteristic professional bearing, though I noticed that the tremor in his hands had become more pronounced. He settled into the chair with careful precision, as if each movement required conscious thought. "Doctor," Poirot began, "your recent consultations with Lady Ashworth, they concerned more than hypothetical questions about nervous disorders. Did they not?" Thorne adjusted his spectacles, a gesture I'd come to recognize as a nervous habit. Lady Ashworth was deeply concerned about someone in her household. She described symptoms she had observed: increasing agitation, periods of confusion, behavior that seemed disconnected from reality. She suspected mental illness. She feared it. There was a family history, you see. Her brother, Evelyn's father, had suffered from what we now understand to be a hereditary condition affecting judgment and emotional stability. Lady Ashworth had begun to notice similar patterns in her niece. The revelation cast Miss Hartwell's earlier testimony in a more troubling light. "And your professional opinion, Doctor?" Stress can certainly trigger or accelerate such conditions. The combination of financial pressure, social disgrace, and complete dependence on her aunt's favor. Thorne shook his head gravely. Lady Ashworth was considering the necessity of medical supervision, perhaps even institutional care if the symptoms progressed. "A devastating prospect for a young woman," Poirot observed quietly. "Indeed, and one that Lady Ashworth approached with great reluctance but absolute determination. She felt responsible for Evelyn's welfare, but also for the safety of others." The psychological web tightens. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot conducted similar conversations with Colonel Weatherby and Mr. Blackwood, each revealing layers of complexity beneath their public facades. The colonel, despite his military bearing, proved to be in dire financial straits, having lost his pension through unwise speculation. Blackwood, while cleared of embezzlement charges, admitted to a relationship with Lady Ashworth that had grown increasingly strained as she became more suspicious and controlling. "Each of our suspects," Poirot mused to me as we prepared for dinner, "carries the weight of secrets that could destroy them. Yet secrets alone do not make murderers. It is the psychology, the capacity for decisive action in the face of desperate circumstances." It was then that we made a discovery that would prove crucial to the case. While examining Lady Ashworth's correspondence more thoroughly, Poirot found a letter she had begun but never finished, not the one about altering her will, but another addressed to a private investigator in London. "Observe, Hastings," he said, holding the paper to the light. "She writes, 'I require your services to investigate certain financial irregularities and to verify the mental competency of a family member. The matter is most urgent, as I fear for the safety of all concerned.' The letter is dated 3 days ago, but was never sent. The implications were staggering. Lady Ashworth had not only discovered financial crimes, but had also planned to have Evelyn declared mentally incompetent, a move that would have stripped her of any inheritance and likely resulted in her commitment to an asylum. "But Poirot," I said, "if Evelyn is truly suffering from a hereditary mental condition, could she be held responsible for murder? Could she have planned and executed such an elaborate crime?" Poirot's mustache twitched with that familiar intensity. "Ah, but that is precisely the question, mon ami. The modification of the grandfather clock required technical knowledge, precise timing, and careful planning. A mind in the grip of hereditary dementia could not execute such complexity." His eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "No, Hastings, our murderer is not the victim of mental illness, but they are most certainly willing to exploit the tragic condition of another to conceal their own guilt." The grandfather clock chimed 6 o'clock, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a countdown to justice. As we prepared to join the others for what would prove to be a most eventful dinner, I realized that Poirot had not only identified the killer's method, but had begun to understand the cruel psychology that would use a young woman's mental fragility as both motive and camouflage for murder. The game had entered its most dangerous phase, where truth and deception would dance their final, deadly waltz. The dinner hour at Thornfield Manor that evening possessed the brittle quality of fine crystal under stress, beautiful on the surface, yet ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. The grandfather clock's measured ticking seemed to count down toward revelations that none of the assembled company appeared eager to face, while Poirot orchestrated the evening's conversation with the precision of a master conductor preparing for his symphony's crescendo. The psychological game begins. Poirot had arranged the seating with characteristic attention to detail, positioning himself where he could observe all the suspects while maintaining an air of casual dinner conversation. The candles flickered in their silver holders, casting dancing shadows across faces that had grown increasingly haggard since Lady Ashworth's death, and I noticed that each guest seemed to be performing a careful pantomime of normalcy. "I trust," Poirot began conversationally as the soup course was served, "that everyone has found today's developments illuminating." Dr. Thorne's spoon trembled slightly as he lifted it to his lips, the nervous tremor in his hands, now so pronounced that he struggled to manage even simple tasks. Illuminating, perhaps, but deeply disturbing. To think that someone in this house harbored such murderous intentions. "Indeed," Poirot agreed mildly, "though I find myself increasingly convinced that our murderer's intentions were not born of sudden passion, but of careful calculation. The modification of the grandfather clock, the fabrication of financial records, the precise timing of the crime itself, all suggest someone with both intimate knowledge of the household and considerable technical expertise." Miss Evelyn Hartwell, who had been picking at her food with mechanical precision, looked up sharply. "Technical expertise? Surely you're not suggesting this was some sort of professional assassination?" "Not professional in the criminal sense, mademoiselle, but rather professional in the medical sense. The precision required to modify a complex timepiece, the understanding of acoustics necessary to mask a gunshot, the clinical knowledge needed to ensure instant death. These skills suggest someone with extensive scientific training." Colonel Weatherby cleared his throat with military precision. "Good God, Poirot. You make it sound like the work of some sort of mad scientist rather than a desperate killer." "Perhaps," Poirot replied thoughtfully, "the distinction is not as clear as we might wish to believe." The poetry book Revelation. It was during the main course that Poirot produced his most startling piece of evidence. Excusing himself briefly, he returned with a small leather-bound volume that I recognized as one of Lady Ashworth's personal books. "Lady Ashworth's copy of Tennyson," he announced, holding up the worn volume. "Found this afternoon in her study, carefully placed beneath her correspondence as if she wished to ensure its discovery." He opened the book to a page marked with a dried flower, revealing Lady Ashworth's distinctive handwriting in the margin. "Observe, if you please, this curious notation. a small drawing of a clock, followed by the number 13, then an arrow pointing to the initials EH, and finally, a question mark. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Miss Hartwell's face drained of all color, and she gripped her wine-glass with such force that I feared it might shatter. That doesn't mean anything," she stammered. Aunt Margaret was always making cryptic notes. She probably just noticed the clock's strange behavior and was wondering if I had observed it too. Inspector Graves, who had been dining with us at Poirot's invitation, leaned forward with renewed interest. "Miss Hartwell, this notation suggests your aunt suspected you of tampering with the grandfather clock, combined with Dr. Thorne's testimony about her concerns regarding your mental state. It creates a compelling narrative," Poirot agreed quietly. A young woman, facing financial ruin and the prospect of institutional commitment, driven to desperate measures to protect herself from exposure. The trap springs. But even as the evidence seemed to point inexorably toward Miss Hartwell, I noticed that Poirot's attention had shifted to Dr. Thorne, whose reaction to the poetry book revelation had been subtly but significantly different from the others. While everyone else had focused on the implications for Evelyn, the doctor's eyes had fixed on the book itself with an expression that seemed almost satisfied. "However," Poirot continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "there is one small detail, one tiny imperfection in this otherwise perfect construction of guilt that tells me we are witnessing not evidence, but performance." He closed the book with deliberate care. "You see, the specific hereditary condition that Dr. Thorne described to us, the one affecting judgment and emotional stability, manifests with particular symptoms. Chief among them is an inability to engage in complex, multi-step planning. The mind affected by such a condition cannot, by its very nature, orchestrate the intricate deception we have witnessed." Dr. Thorne's fork clattered against his plate. "What are you suggesting, Monsieur Poirot?" "I am suggesting, mon ami, that someone has taken great care to create evidence implicating Miss Hartwell, knowing that her family history of mental illness would make such accusations credible. Someone who understood that the authorities would naturally focus on the most obvious suspect when presented with such compelling and conveniently discovered evidence." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the adjacent room. Dr. Thorne had gone completely pale, and the tremor in his hands had become so violent that he was forced to clasp them together in his lap. The technical revelation. Poirot rose from his chair and began to pace slowly around the table, his movements creating a sense of inexorable closing circle. The modification of the grandfather clock required not only mechanical knowledge, but specific understanding of acoustics and timing. A medical man, particularly one with military experience, would possess such skills. The falsification of financial records demanded intimate knowledge of Lady Ashworth's business affairs, knowledge that her long-standing physician would have acquired through years of confidential consultations about her estate planning and family concerns. "Dr. Thorne," he continued, his voice gentle but relentless, "your recent consultations with Lady Ashworth were not merely about observing symptoms in others, were they? They were about managing symptoms in yourself, symptoms that threatened to destroy everything you had built over 40 years of medical practice." The doctor's carefully maintained facade finally began to crack. "She was going to ruin me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. 40 years of service, of healing, of dedication, all of it swept away by her moral certainty. "And so you decided to ruin her instead," Poirot observed without judgment. "You arranged the meeting in her study, brought your service revolver, and used your medical knowledge to ensure that death would be instantaneous. The 13th chime provided perfect acoustic camouflage for the gunshot, while the fabricated evidence would direct suspicion toward either Mr. Blackwood or Miss Hartwell." Inspector Graves had his notebook ready, but Dr. Thorne held up a trembling hand. "Not yet, Inspector. Not yet. There are still details that must be explained, consequences that must be considered. The grandfather clock chimed 9 o'clock, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a funeral bell tolling for the death of trust and the illusion of civilized behavior. As we prepared to adjourn to the drawing room, I realized that Poirot had not only identified the killer, but had begun the delicate process of psychological dismantlement that would ultimately force a full confession. The 13th hour was approaching its end, but the final revelations and the complete unraveling of Dr. Thorne's elaborate deception still awaited us in the drama's concluding acts. The drawing room possessed an oppressive stillness, as though the very walls of Thornfield Manor were holding their breath in anticipation of revelations that would shatter the last vestiges of civilized pretense. Dr. Thorne sat rigidly in his chair near the sideboard, his medical bag clutched with white-knuckled desperation, while the other suspects arranged themselves with the wary reluctance of chess pieces sensing inevitable checkmate. Inspector Graves positioned himself strategically by the door, his notebook ready, while Poirot assumed his characteristic pose near the fireplace with that particular grace that somehow transformed even the most formal interrogation into an exercise in psychological precision. The grandfather clock's measured ticking seemed to count down toward justice with maddening composure. "Dr. Thorne," Poirot began gently, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made resistance seem both futile and undignified. "You wished Inspector Graves to wait. You spoke of details requiring explanation. Perhaps you would care to illuminate us now." The doctor's laugh was short and mirthless, carrying within it the hollow quality of a man who had exhausted his capacity for deception. "You make it sound so clinical, Monsieur Poirot, as though one could simply arrange the events of recent months like a medical case study and have done with it." "On the contrary," Poirot replied with characteristic precision, "the events are already clear in their essentials. It is the why, not the how, that interests me most keenly." Dr. Thorne's gaze moved slowly around the room, lingering on each face before returning to Poirot with something approaching relief. "She was going to destroy me," he said abruptly, his voice growing steadier as he retreated into familiar professional territory. Margaret Ashworth, with her absolute moral certainty and her conviction that duty trumped all other considerations. "You refer to your medical condition," Poirot observed quietly, "the progressive neurological deterioration that you have been concealing from your patients and colleagues." "Parkinson's disease," Thorne confirmed, his hands trembling violently as if the admission had released some internal restraint. "The tremors you observe are merely the visible symptoms. The real devastation lies in the gradual loss of fine motor control, the increasing difficulty with precise surgical procedures, the growing risk of catastrophic errors during operations." Miss Evelyn Hartwell leaned forward with sudden understanding. "That's why Aunt Margaret was asking you about nervous disorders and hereditary conditions. She wasn't concerned about me at all. She was observing your symptoms." "Precisely," Thorne replied, his voice carrying a note of bitter admiration. "Margaret had begun to notice my difficulties during recent visits. A servant's minor wound that should have required simple suturing became a complex procedure due to my trembling hands. She demanded that I retire immediately and report my condition to the medical council." The implications were staggering. 40 years of distinguished medical practice reduced to nothing by the inexorable progression of a degenerative disease, compounded by the threat of professional disgrace and financial ruin. "And so you chose to eliminate the threat rather than face the consequences," Inspector Graves observed grimly. "I chose to survive," Thorne corrected with desperate dignity. "Lady Ashworth gave me no alternative, no opportunity for gradual retirement, no consideration for the patients who still depended on me. She appointed herself judge, jury, and executioner of my entire life's work." Poirot's expression remained carefully neutral. The modification of the grandfather clock required considerable technical expertise. "Medical training includes substantial mechanical knowledge," Thorne replied with a trace of professional pride breaking through his despair. "Understanding of precision instruments, timing mechanisms, the physics of sound transmission. During the war, I maintained medical equipment under combat conditions. Modifying the clock's striking mechanism was complex, but well within my capabilities. He gestured toward the timepiece with his shaking hand. I spent 3 nights working on it, using surgical instruments to create a secondary release mechanism triggered by the completion of the normal 12 chimes. The timing had to be perfect. The gunshot had to coincide exactly with that impossible 13th strike. Creating perfect acoustic camouflage, Poirot observed. Rose heard only what sounded like a heavy object falling, not the report of your service revolver. A .32 caliber pistol, fired at the moment of maximum sound interference, Thorne confirmed. Lady Ashworth was reaching for her brandy glass when I fired. Death was instantaneous, exactly as I intended. Colonel Weatherby's military background gave him insight into the tactical thinking involved. And the fabricated evidence against Blackwood and Miss Hartwell? I had treated Lady Ashworth for over 20 years. I knew her handwriting intimately, her business practices, her filing systems. Creating convincing forgeries was time-consuming but not technically difficult. His voice carried bitter satisfaction. I knew the authorities would focus on obvious motives, financial gain or hereditary instability, rather than looking for more complex psychological motivations. The medical bag slipped from his trembling fingers, spilling its contents across the Persian carpet. Syringes, medication vials, and surgical instruments that now seemed more like implements of destruction than healing. The irony is perfect, he whispered, staring at his shaking hands. I killed to preserve my ability to heal, and in doing so, destroyed any possibility of ever healing again. Inspector Graves stepped forward with grim finality. Dr. Julian Thorne, I'm arresting you for the willful murder of Lady Margaret Ashworth. As the constable led him away, Dr. Thorne's shoulders slumped with the weight of his confession, 40 years of carefully constructed respectability collapsing under the burden of one desperate, irreversible act. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its sound now seeming less like a timekeeper than a funeral bell tolling for the death of trust and the terrible price of placing professional pride above moral duty. The morning after Dr. Thorne's arrest dawned gray and subdued, as though Thornfield Manor itself was recovering from the shock of having its genteel facade stripped away to reveal the desperate calculations that had lurked beneath. The grandfather clock in the drawing room resumed its honest rhythm, no longer complicit in deception, while the remaining inhabitants of the house prepared to face whatever futures awaited them beyond the shadow of murder. Miss Evelyn Hartwell appeared at breakfast, pale but composed, her mourning dress lending her a dignity that had been absent during the terrible uncertainties of the previous days. Monsieur Poirot, she said quietly as she took her seat, I find myself in the peculiar position of being grateful for a tragedy that has freed me from an even greater one. Poirot regarded her with that gentle yet penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond surface appearances. Your aunt's concerns about your mental state, mademoiselle, were manipulated by Dr. Thorne for his own purposes. But the pressures that gave those concerns credibility, those were real, were they not? Painfully real, she admitted. The constant scrutiny, the financial dependence, the knowledge that one misstep could result in complete ruin. Dr. Thorne understood that my own anxieties would make his fabricated evidence seem plausible. She paused, then added with quiet determination, But I am not my father, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever weaknesses I may possess, I will not allow them to define my future. Colonel Weatherby joined us shortly thereafter, his military bearing intact but somehow softened by the revelations of recent days. Extraordinary thing, he observed, settling into his chair with careful precision. 40 years I've known Julian Thorne. Served together in India, shared countless conversations about duty and honor. Yet when faced with the prospect of professional destruction, he chose murder over honesty. That is precisely what made him so dangerous, mon coroner, Poirot replied thoughtfully. Dr. Thorne was not a criminal by nature, but a respected professional driven to desperate measures. Such men possess both the intelligence to plan elaborately and the conviction that their actions are justified by circumstances. Mr. Blackwood appeared as we were finishing breakfast, his usual. Professional composure restored but marked by a new wariness. "The solicitors will arrive this afternoon to begin settling Lady Ashworth's affairs," he reported. "Miss Hartwell, you'll need to make decisions about the estate's future management." "Decisions I'm finally free to make without fear of having them overruled by concerns about my competency," she replied with bitter irony. "Dr. Thorne's attempt to frame you, Mr. Blackwood, would have left me entirely at the mercy of court-appointed guardians, had it succeeded." Poirot rose and moved to examine the grandfather clock one final time, his small hands tracing its brass mechanism with reverent care. "This timepiece tells us something profound about the nature of deception, mes amis. Dr. Thorne modified it not merely to mask the sound of his gunshot, but to create a moment of impossible reality that would disorient witnesses and investigators alike." He turned to face the assembled company, his green eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. The 13th chime was Dr. Thorne's masterpiece of misdirection, a sound that violated natural law, and thereby prepared everyone to accept that other impossible things might also be true. Who would question falsified financial records when they had just heard time itself lie? Inspector Graves arrived mid-morning to collect final statements and confirm procedural details. "Dr. Thorne has provided a complete written confession," he reported with grim satisfaction. The technical aspects of how he modified the clock mechanism, the methods he used to forge Lady Ashworth's handwriting, even the psychological calculations behind his choice of scapegoats. "It's the most thorough confession I've encountered in 20 years of police work." "A final act of professional precision," Poirot observed quietly. Even in his guilt, Dr. Thorne cannot abandon the habits of thoroughness that defined his medical career. He understands that incomplete work, whether surgical or criminal, inevitably leads to complications. As the day progressed and preparations for departure began, I found myself reflecting on the strange alchemy by which a weekend of country hospitality had transformed into a meditation on the fragility of human dignity. Dr. Thorne's tragedy lay not merely in his crime, but in his inability to conceive of identity beyond professional achievement. When disease threatened to strip away his surgical skills, he could imagine no self worth preserving. "The grandfather clock strikes 12 once more," Poirot mused as we prepared to leave Thornfield Manor. "Its mechanical integrity has been restored, and with it, the honest measurement of time. But the human mechanisms involved in this tragedy, they cannot be repaired so easily." Our taxi arrived as the clock chimed noon, its sound clear and true, unmarked by the impossible 13th stroke that had announced Lady Ashworth's death. As we drove away from the manor, I took one final look at the drawing room windows where the timepiece continued its faithful service, keeping perfect time once again. "Justice has been served," I remarked, though the words felt somehow inadequate to the complexity of what we had witnessed. "Justice, yes," Poirot agreed thoughtfully. "But at what cost? The truth, Hastings, is often more tragic than the lies it replaces, yet it possesses something that deception never can, the dignity of reality, however painful that reality may prove to be." The train journey back to London provided the sort of contemplative silence that Poirot often required after the resolution of a particularly complex case. As the English countryside rolled past our compartment window in a blur of hedgerows and distant church spires, I found myself still grappling with the psychological intricacies of Dr. Thorne's elaborate deception. "You are troubled, mon ami," Poirot observed, noting my preoccupied silence as he adjusted his cuffs with characteristic precision. "I find myself thinking about the nature of desperation," I admitted. Dr. Thorne was, by all accounts, a man of principle and integrity for 4 decades. Yet when faced with the prospect of professional ruin, he transformed into someone capable of cold-blooded murder and the most cruel manipulation. Poirot's green eyes grew thoughtful. "It is the paradox of the civilized mind, Hastings. The very qualities that make a man respected in society, pride in his achievements, dedication to his profession, fear of public disgrace, can become the instruments of his moral destruction when circumstances threaten to strip them away. Dr. Thorne could accept disease of the body, but not the spiritual death of his reputation." The train's rhythm seemed to echo the grandfather clock's measured ticking, and I found myself wondering whether time itself had become complicit in the tragedy. The modification of that clock was truly ingenious, I admitted, to use it not merely as camouflage for the gunshot, but as a psychological weapon to disorient everyone present. But there you touch upon something most significant," Poirot replied, his mustache twitching with renewed interest. "Dr. Thorne understood that the human mind craves logical explanations, even for impossible events. By creating one impossibility, the 13th chime, he prepared everyone to accept other impossibilities as plausible. The falsified financial records, the convenient discovery of incriminating evidence, all became credible because reality itself had already been called into question." I shuddered at the implications. "You mean he was manipulating not just the physical evidence, but our very perception of what was possible?" "Précisément. The grandfather clock that struck 13 was not merely a mechanical impossibility. It was a perfect metaphor for Dr. Thorne's own situation. He had pushed his deception one step beyond what reality could sustain, and, like that impossible 13th chime, the whole elaborate structure was destined to collapse." As we approached the outskirts of London, I raised a question that had been troubling me. That poetry book with Lady Ashworth's marginal notes, the sketch of the clock, the number 13, the initials EH with the question mark. Were those genuine or part of Dr. Thorne's fabrication? Poirot's eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. They were her genuine markings, Hastings. Lady Ashworth had indeed begun to suspect that someone was manipulating the grandfather clock, and her natural suspicion fell upon her troubled niece. Dr. Thorne discovered this notation among her papers and recognized its value as evidence against Miss Hartwell. He left the book positioned where we would find it, knowing it would appear to strengthen the case against her. So he used Lady Ashworth's own suspicions as a weapon against her niece? Indeed. It was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deception, exploiting a young woman's legitimate anxieties about hereditary illness, using her genuine distress as both motive and camouflage for his own villainy. To manipulate her family's medical history so ruthlessly demonstrates a level of psychological brutality that transcends mere murder. The train pulled into Victoria Station with a great hiss of steam, returning us to the familiar chaos of London life. As we gathered our belongings and hailed a taxi, I found myself wondering about the fates of those we had left behind at Thornfield Manor. "What will become of Miss Hartwell?" I asked as our cab navigated the busy streets. "She will inherit her aunt's estate, of course, but more importantly, she will inherit the freedom to define herself without the constant threat of being declared mentally incompetent. The truth, however painful, has a liberating quality. She now understands the depths of human deception, but also possesses the clarity that comes from surviving such manipulation. And Mr. Blackwood will continue managing the estate, I suspect, though with considerably more autonomy than Lady Ashworth ever permitted. The irony is that his loyalty to her, which made him such a convenient scapegoat, will likely ensure his continued employment with her niece. The unjust accusation, once disproven, often serves to highlight the true character of the accused." As we arrived at our familiar lodgings at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot settled into his favorite armchair with a rare, reflective sigh. "The human heart, Hastings, is a most fascinating and often frightening mechanism. Dr. Thorne possessed 4 decades of medical knowledge and diagnostic expertise that could have continued to benefit society even after his surgical skills declined. He might have become a teacher, a consultant, a researcher. Instead, his inability to conceive of identity beyond the operating theater led him to choose destruction over adaptation. The irony is almost unbearable, I agreed. He killed to preserve his ability to heal, and in doing so, destroyed any possibility of healing. Poirot picked up a small ornate object from his mantelpiece, turning it over in his delicate fingers with the same precision he had used to examine the grandfather clock's mechanism. It is always the small things, mon ami, the tiny flaws in the grand design that ultimately betray the truth. The single, misplaced error in the ledger, designed to appear authentically human yet strategically placed to implicate Blackwood. The choice of a specific medical condition that, ironically, would preclude such elaborate planning. These are the threads that, when pulled, unravel the entire tapestry of lies. He placed the object back in its precise position. Our murderer believed he was orchestrating a perfect crime, a performance designed to fool all who witnessed it. But he underestimated the persistence of certain Belgian detectives to restore order where chaos has been deliberately sown. As evening settled over London, I reflected on how the impossible sound of that 13th chime had served as both announcement and metaphor for the tragedy that followed. Time itself became a weapon in Dr. Thorne's hands, I mused. Indeed, but time also became his enemy. Poirot replied quietly. The progressive nature of his condition meant that every day of delay in confronting his situation made his position more desperate, his options more limited. Had he been honest about his diagnosis from the beginning, he might have found dignity in a gradual transition from active practice to emeritus status. Instead, he chose deception, which led inevitably to greater deceptions, until murder seemed the only solution. The order of the universe, Hastings, must always be maintained, Poirot concluded with characteristic finality. And sometimes it takes the most impossible sound to reveal the most unpleasant truths. The grandfather clock has returned to keeping honest time, but for those who heard its impossible chime, it will always mark the boundary between illusion and reality. The case of the clock that struck 13 was closed, but its lessons about the fragility of human dignity and the terrible price of refusing to accept the limitations that time and circumstance impose upon us all would endure far beyond the resolution of Lady Ashworth's murder. As I prepared for bed that evening, I could not help but think that, whatever darkness we might encounter in the future, Hercule Poirot would be there with his unfailing sense of order, ready to set both clocks and consciences to their proper time once more. 6 weeks after our return from Thornfield Manor, London's familiar rhythms had restored a sense of normalcy to our lives at Whitehaven Mansions. Yet the case of the impossible chime continued to resonate in ways that neither Poirot nor I had anticipated. The Morning Post brought revelations that would provide the most satisfying conclusion to our extraordinary investigation. Poirot sat at his writing desk, methodically organizing the final documents of the case with characteristic precision. "Order, Hastings," he murmured as he aligned the papers with geometric exactitude, "must be imposed not only upon events, but upon memory itself. Otherwise, the lessons of experience become merely, how do you say, a jumble of impressions." The letter that arrived that morning bore Miss Evelyn Hartwell's elegant stationery and contained news that would have astonished even Poirot's considerable powers of deduction. As I read aloud, his eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. A rare occurrence indeed. Lady Ashworth had indeed altered her will, I announced, but not in the manner anyone supposed. 3 days before her death, she had actually increased my inheritance and removed all restrictions on my financial independence. Her recent observations of my behavior had convinced her that my anxieties were situational rather than hereditary, caused by uncertainty rather than mental illness. Poirot's mustache twitched with profound satisfaction. Magnifique. Dr. Thorne's psychological manipulation achieved precisely the opposite of his intention. By encouraging Lady Ashworth to observe her niece more carefully, he provided the very evidence that would exonerate Miss Hartwell from suspicions of hereditary instability. The letter continued with even more remarkable developments. Miss Hartwell had used her newfound financial freedom to establish a medical foundation dedicated to supporting physicians facing career-ending illnesses. A gesture of extraordinary compassion toward the very condition that had driven Dr. Thorne to murder. She writes that she hopes to prevent other doctors from facing the desperate choice between professional disgrace and criminal action, I continued. The foundation will provide financial support, alternative career guidance, and most importantly, the dignity of honest transition from active practice to emeritus status. She transforms personal tragedy into public good, Poirot observed with genuine admiration. It is the alchemy of the human spirit, creating meaning from suffering in a manner that honors both victim and perpetrator. Perhaps most intriguingly, Miss Hartwell had commissioned a master clockmaker to examine the grandfather clock thoroughly, not to repair Dr. Thorne's modifications, but to preserve them as a permanent memorial. The clockmaker's report confirms that Dr. Thorne's mechanical work was absolutely brilliant, she wrote. Rather than destroying his modifications, I've had them preserved as a reminder of how intelligence without moral foundation becomes a tool of destruction rather than creation. Poirot rose and began his characteristic pacing, his green eyes bright with intellectual satisfaction. She understands something profound, mon ami. The clock now serves dual purposes, keeping honest time while preserving the memory of one impossible moment when human desperation tried to make time itself an accomplice to murder. The letter concluded with news of the other principals. Mr. Blackwood had continued as a state manager with expanded responsibilities and Miss Hartwell's complete trust. Colonel Weatherby had found meaningful employment with the charitable foundation, his organizational skills proving invaluable. Most remarkably, Dr. Thorne had begun writing a comprehensive medical memoir documenting his experiences with Parkinson's disease, intended as both confession and clinical study to help other physicians facing similar challenges. Even in his imprisonment, Poirot mused, he cannot abandon the habits of thoroughness that defined his career, but now, instead of concealing medical truth, he reveals it. Instead of protecting reputation through deception, he serves science through honesty. As afternoon shadows lengthened across our sitting room, I found myself reflecting on the strange transformation of tragedy into wisdom. The case has achieved something remarkable, I observed. Justice served, lessons learned, and even a form of redemption for the guilty party. Indeed, Hastings, the grandfather clock at Thornfield Manor now performs its greatest service, not merely measuring the passage of honest hours, but preserving the memory of human fallibility and the possibility of moral restoration. Poirot adjusted the small ornate clock on our mantelpiece with delicate precision. Dr. Thorne sought to stop time, to freeze his professional reputation at its peak moment. Instead, he discovered that time's greatest gift is not preservation, but the opportunity for growth through honest acknowledgement of our mortal limitations. The familiar chime of 6 o'clock from our properly functioning timepiece seemed to whisper that order had been restored. Justice had been transformed into mercy, and time itself had returned to its honest work of measuring not just the passage of hours, but the gradual accumulation of human wisdom in the face of our most profound moral challenges. The 13th hour has ended, Poirot concluded with characteristic finality, but its echoes will continue to remind us that the greatest crimes are often committed not by evil men, but by good men who have lost the courage to face the truth about themselves. As London's evening sounds drifted through our windows, I understood that Hercule Poirot had achieved something greater than solving a murder. He had helped transform a tragedy into a testament to the resilience of human dignity and the eternal possibility of redemption through truth.